Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. Welcome back to the show. Took a little time off. Now we're back. Video on global warming, global climate change, and propaganda. Some of the hardcore environmentalists out there should know about some of this, but most people, I would assume, have never heard of some of this information before. So, thanks for joining me today. We're going to start out with Statista. It's a really cool statistics website. We got the per capita CO2 emissions worldwide 2020. You see a lot in the corporate news media about the leading emissions countries being China, developed nations like the United States. But you never hear about countries like Qatar, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates. This is important information because on the TV they make it seem like, oh, it's just China and the United States. But in reality, there's some really heavy players at work here, especially when we talk about prices around the world. So now we're at the Daily Mail. How 16 ships create as much pollution as all the cars in the world. Eco expert Fred Pierce, environmental consultant, compiled all this information for us today. 16 of the biggest tanker ships transporting goods and oil all over the world are pretty much producing as much CO2 emissions as every single car on Earth. You don't really hear about that in the TV. But all of the so-called environmentalists who go to Walmart, Costco, take advantage of these quote-unquote low prices from globalist shipping lanes. They're essentially culpable in what we term as global climate change. So we're moving on. Here's another researcher, James Corbett, professor of marine policy at the University of Delaware. He came upon the same conclusion: world's 15 biggest ships create more pollution than all the cars in the world. This was way back in 2013, but most people, again, have not heard of it. Again, on the corporate news media, they say it's poor people driving minivans, cooking their meals on a fire that creates quote-unquote global climate change, but it's actually the globalist shipping lanes owned by the 1% who are producing most of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. And of course, they don't want anybody to know about that. We're moving along here. The Guardian. World's richest 1% cause double CO2 emissions than that of the 50% poorest people on Earth. Wealthiest 1% of the world's population are responsible for emissions more than twice as much carbon dioxide as the poorer half of the world from 90s to 2015. So the more money you have, essentially, the more you contribute to the deleterious effects of global climate change. Again, the more money you have, the more you go to Costco, Whole Foods, Walmart, trying to get those deals that are essentially just what they call environmental externalities. The reason why they're so cheap is because we're basically using the environment or abusing the environment in globalist shipping routes. Moving along here, we're at Reuters. Handful of cities driving urban greenhouse gas emissions, study says. Just 25 biggest cities, almost all of them in China, accounted for more than half of the global climate warming gases pumped out by a sample of 167 urban hubs around the world. The study compared greenhouse gas emissions reported by 167 cities in 53 countries and found that 23 of the Chinese cities, among them Shanghai, Beijing, and Handan, along with Moscow and Tokyo, accounted for 52% of global emissions. So we're putting the picture together here, everyone. Stay with me. Now we're analyzing kind of the tangential topics that contribute to global climate change, quote unquote. Where the energy goes, gasoline vehicles, only about 12 to 30% of the energy from your car is used to move it down the road. That means that the engine loses 60 to 70% and even more, possibly in diesel engines. 60 to 70% of the energy being used is wasted and not doing anything. So this efficiency problem is very important and very pertinent to the emission standards regarding global climate change, because on the one hand, we're all talking about reducing our emissions when our technology is woefully undeveloped. All right, now we're at InsideEnergy.org, lost in transmission. How much electricity disappears between a power plant and your plug? This is a really interesting one that you never hear on the TV. Basically, energy lost in power plants accounts for about 70% loss of all energy created. So when we create the energy, whether it be from a power plant, a wind farm, a solar farm, it goes into the grid, and the grid, which is composed of all of these power lines, in that process, around 70% of the energy is lost. So even if it's a green, quote-unquote, renewable source like you hear on the corporate television, all of this energy is still being lost because of the nature of the grid itself. And that's another one you don't really hear about. Okay, now we're at the EIA.gov website. Today in Energy, the title of this one, penned in 2020, more than 60% of energy used for electricity generation is lost in conversion. So this is yet another interesting conundrum. When we convert the electricity energy into the different modalities used for industry and residential use, 60% of that energy simply disappears as heat just in the conversion itself. So that has nothing to do with the 70% loss from the electric grid or anything of that sort. So this is a compounding problem of efficiency. All right, and now you would, most people would assume that electric cars are going to be really green because they say so on the corporate television. But in reality, they create just as much emissions and toxic chemicals as the auto industry. This brings up another interesting point. On TV, they will say, oh, well, we need these electric cars or different types of technologies, but really, it's all about the use. How much are we using? How much do we really need? We're talking about urban sprawl, lots of different things, high commutes from cheap areas to city centers, which are more expensive. So that's really the theme of the entire energy usage is the problem, not just the technologies that are involved. And of course, electric cars are heavily invested in the 1% richest people on Earth. It's essentially they're moving their assets out of oil using climate change and into electric batteries, which are terribly toxic. And so are electric cars really greener? YouMatter.world. And I just found this little tiny blip here, for instance, to produce 1 ton of rare earth elements like lithium, nickel, cobalt, and graphite, which are used in these batteries, 75 tons of acidic waste are produced, and even 1 ton of radioactive residues are also made, according to the Chinese Society of Rare Earths. So, if we were to replace all of our carbon emissions vehicles with electric cars, we're going to be polluting the water table with extremely toxic waste, as well as the refinement, the energy required to refine these rare earth elements. And on TV, like Tesla, they'll say, oh, well, we can reuse these batteries when they're all done. We just refurbish the batteries and then you can use them again. But in order to do that, you have to refine them. So not only are you expending massive amounts of energy, quote unquote, either from green sources like solar panels or black sources like carbon, coal power plants, you're still wasting a lot of energy simply refining these elements back into a usable state to create more batteries, to quote unquote recycle these batteries. So it's a total fallacy what they try to tell you on the TV. Alright, so I just put this in there. A little interesting. Yes, the United States does lead countries in reducing carbon emissions. We're on the Forbes magazine. Usually on TV you see, oh, the United States is so bad, but in reality we're actually leading the world in carbon emissions. So great job, everybody. But in reality also, we want to reduce our usage of these technologies, not just the emissions technologies. So now we're at cleantechnica.com. They have a nice little graphic here, very complex, and I just wanted to put this in here. US wastes 61 to 86% of its energy, published in 2013. Again, a lot of good science coming out of that year. So this is not just a United States problem. This again is going to the coal-fired power plants, toxic substances used to create wind farms and solar farms and electric car batteries. So even in developed countries from around the world, they're still wasting around 60 to 90% of their total energy, no matter how it's produced, whether it be a quote-unquote so-called green energy source or otherwise, because of the facts that we went over in the previous editorials. So yeah, on the TV, of course, they will try to paint this picture like, oh, well, if we just have a different type of technology, we'll be able to save all this problem, but solve all these problems. But that's not true. The problem itself underlining all of these issues are the way society is structured. So no matter how much lipstick we try to put on this pig, it's not going to really solve any of the underlying issues. It's just going to, pat ourselves on the back type of situation. So I hope you guys found this interesting. This is one of my favorite topics, being an environmental scientist. And yeah, these are some really interesting articles that you don't really hear on the TV because it's owned by the 1%, etc. So I hope you guys found this interesting today. Thanks again for joining me. See ya.